PJR's webinar on process mapping and process-based internal audits. My name is Shannon Beck, and I'm the Companies and Affiliations Manager for PJR. Thanks for attending today's webinar. All participants are in listen-only mode. This is simply to ensure sound quality. There'll be plenty of time for questions at the end of today's presentation, so please type them into the question or chat feature, and I'll do my best to answer as many questions as possible. In addition, a digital playback and copies of the slides will be available on our website, www.pjr.com, under the section that says Webinars. There you will also see information on upcoming webinars. The webinars planned for about the next 6 months on some new topics. Today, we're going to be talking about a number of different things. First of all, why are we doing this? Why was this particular topic chosen? I'm getting a little bit of feedback, folks, that it's difficult to hear me. I just made some administrative announcements. If somebody can chime in and let me know if the volume is getting better, that would be great. So we're talking today about why we're doing this, why we selected this particular topic. We'll also be talking about some terminology. We'll be defining some terms so that we're all on the same page here. Process mapping symbols, different symbols used to visualize a process. We'll be talking about a square, lines with arrowheads. We'll be talking about different ways to visualize a process maps, flow charts, etc. We'll be talking about a very practical example to solidify some of the theory that we talk about when we're looking at a bakery. And then we'll be talking about the process approach to auditing. So first of all, why did we select this topic? Outcomes should matter to certified organizations and to companies such as PJR that offer accredited certification. I can tell you that my biggest pet peeve is that organizations that get certified because of customer mandates and don't really care about using the certification to improve the organization, and not only improve the organization internally, but improve the perception of its customers. Better on-time delivery and on-quality delivery. So, you know, we really try to avoid customers that just want to fly the flag. There's a mandate for certification bodies to not just look for conformity to requirements. After a while, it's easy to conform to the requirements of a given standard. We're looking for clear measures of true process improvement. And this is one of the reasons our audit workbooks ask very specific questions about how you're measuring yourself, what the targets are, and how you react if you do not meet a target. The intent is that organizations should derive benefit from accredited certification, and a certified organization's customers should derive benefit from this accredited certification. So talking an accredited QMS certification process, it's PJR's intent that it ensures the following. Obviously, that your management system meets the requirements of the relevant standard. Second, we want to make sure that you're analyzing and understanding your customer requirements and you're aware of any relevant statutory and regulatory requirements, and that product characteristics have been defined. We want to make sure that you've identified and managed the processes needed to achieve expected outcomes. So if you understand your customer-specific requirements and you know what they want and what they expect, how are you determining the processes needed to achieve these expected outcomes? And that particular point is bolded because we'll be talking about that today. For those of you that have attended our seminar on root cause and systemic corrective action, that aim is to prevent nonconformities and have processes in place to correct nonconformities, analyze root cause, and take corrective action. Today's webinar will also focus on monitoring, measuring, and continually improving the effectiveness of its QMS. So our goal today is to help you identify and manage the processes needed to achieve expected outcomes. What are those expected outcomes? Well, they're the ones most importantly dictated by your customers, dictated by statutory and regulatory requirements, and dictated by you internally. And we want to make sure that you're not only conforming to the requirements of a given standard, but monitoring, measuring, and continually improving the effectiveness of the quality management system. For those of you involved with EMS certification, our goal is to make sure that you're managing your environmental impacts and you're demonstrating a commitment to preventing pollution and meeting legal requirements and continually improving your environmental performance. So just like in a quality management system, you should be setting objectives with targets that help you reduce your impact, your negative impact on the environment, and improve environmental performance. So in summary, the goal of today's webinar is to help you identify and manage the processes needed to achieve expected outcomes, monitor, measure, and continually improve your QMS. We'll talk about effective ways to do this. And we also want to help you continually improve your environmental performance if you are in fact EMS certified. Okay, so let's talk about some terminology first, just to make sure that we're on the same page. First of all, a process. Let's define that. It's a sequence of steps, activities, decisions, or tasks that transform inputs into outputs. We often talk about adding value, and this is when the outputs of a process are of greater value than the inputs. So in the schematic below, you have an input, which is often defined as a customer who has a need for something. Those inputs go through a process, ideally that will add value, and the outputs are a customer who has the need met. So here the output is greater than the input. The input was a customer that had a need. The output is a customer who has a need met. The process boundaries are the designated start and end points of a process. These should be logical and must be determined before a process can be described. And as you saw on the previous slide, they're usually defined as a customer with a need for something and then the need being met. And keep in mind that they can be, if you're defining, for example, a purchasing process, it can be an internal customer, not necessarily a customer external to the organization. Process inputs are any product or service used in the process. The people, the equipment, the material, the documentation, the environment. And the suppliers are those that provide the needed inputs for a process, and they can be internal or external to the organization. Outputs are the product or service created by the process that is of value to the customer. If it's of value to the customer, we can say that the process has added value. Outputs are evidence that work has been completed, and they need to be specific. And we're going to see that often the output of one process is the input of another. Customers are the individuals who benefit from the products or services produced by the process, and they can be both internal or external customers to the organization. So if your process is purchasing, your input would be a customer internal to the organization who has the need to get a PO approved for the order that they desire. The output would be the internal customer of the organization who has an approved PO and can now get the material or equipment purchased that they need. Customer requirements are the needs, wants, or expectations that internal or external customers have for the output of the process. And these requirements may be written or unwritten. Sometimes they're explicitly expressed in a terms and condition document, a purchase order, some type of agreement, a supplier quality manual, and sometimes they're unwritten. Many times there are certain laws or codes that you're expected to comply with, and it's such an expectation that it isn't explicitly expressed. Process owners, an individual who is or are accountable for the process. And the process owners may change depending on how the process is defined, i.e. what the process boundaries are, and it may be a single person or a team of people. The process approach is the application of a system of processes within an organization together with the identification and interaction of these processes and their management. Processes should be automatic and instinctive to all personnel. And I'll talk more about what I mean by automatic and instinctive in coming slides. Okay, before we talk about our example, the bakery, let's spend some time defining different symbols you may see in a process map. The most common symbol are rectangles and then lines with arrowheads. Rectangles are used to identify a discrete activity in the process, and they're usually very short sentence fragments contained in a rectangle, a verb and a direct object. Lines with arrowheads represent the directional flow of the activities in a process. So looking at the example below, we have 3 steps. First, visually inspecting the parts, again a sentence fragment. We have an action verb, inspect, and a direct object, the parts. Place the green label on parts, again an action verb and direct object. And packing the parts. Very simple sentence fragments. You really want to have somebody look at this quickly and understand what the process is. We're avoiding long, complex sentences here, trying to simplify and make it easier for the user to assimilate what the content is. Start and end ovals used to signify the starting and end point of the process. They define the boundaries. Very simple, start in an oval and end in an oval. Decision diamonds represent a decision in the process, and it should be a question that has to be answered with a yes or a no. It usually has 1 line entering and 2 lines leaving. So we follow the process, and here is the part conforming. That's the question. It's a yes-no question in this decision diamond. So if yes, that's one option. You pack in a bin. If no, you label with a red tag and place in a non-conforming bin. A loop displays a part of a process that repeats itself until a specific condition has been met. And it often will take the process back to previous steps. It may indicate activities such as rework. So if we follow this through, coming in on the left, you're inspecting parts and removing flash. Following the line with arrowhead to the decision diamond, there's a question that can be answered with a yes or a no. Is the part free from flash? If yes, you place a green label on the part and pack in a plastic bin. If no, if the part has flash, you're going back to the prior step and inspecting the part and removing the excess flash. And that will repeat itself until you can answer yes. Circles are used to reference or connect another part of the process when the process continues to another page or perhaps to a different process map. When you show a process in parallel, it represents a process or process steps that occur at the same time as another process. And we're going to see this in our bakery example in just a few minutes. Okay, let's talk about different ways to visualize a process. Before we do that, however, let's take a few minutes to discuss the benefits of making a process visible. One thing is process improvement. It allows relationships and sequences to be identified and analyzed. It serves as an aid to problem solving. It's a great way to train employees on change processes and assist in training new employees. It's much easier for a new employee to assimilate a process map as opposed to a lengthy procedure with paragraphs. Most folks are visual learners. In documentation, it clarifies the flow of work in a process. It may eliminate the need for lengthy procedures and work instructions in a narrative format. So here are some ways that we can show the flow of work in a single process. So if we're just taking one process, let's say purchasing, you can use a block diagram or a more complex process map. Visio and Microsoft are two tools you can use to create process maps. A block diagram is a very simple schematic of the major steps in a single process, such as purchasing or manufacturing. It uses rectangles and blocks or blocks and lines with arrowheads. It's not going to get into some of the more complex symbols like decision diamonds or loops. It simply answers the question, what are the steps in the process? How does it work? A detailed schematic of the process, steps, activities, or tasks that shows exactly how something is done is usually accomplished via a process map as opposed to a block diagram. It's going to incorporate some of your more complex process mapping symbols, such as decision diamonds and feedback loops. And unlike a block diagram, it also answers the question not only what is the process, but how does it work? Okay, so block diagrams and process maps can show the flow of a single process. There's a requirement in 9001-2008 and ISO 14001-2004 to show the interrelationship of all of the organization's processes. I like to call this the view from 30,000 feet. This is very different than a block diagram and process map of a single process. And you want to make sure you're also showing outsourced processes in this view from 30,000 feet. So let's look at the 9001-2008 clauses that require the sequence and interaction of processes. So going to section 4.1 of the ISO 9001 standard, and again I always say clause 4.1 is the Reader's Digest version of the standard. Somebody asks you, hey, what's this 9001 document all about? Point them to 4.1. In just those few clauses, it captures the essence of the standard. So the first thing you need to do is identify the processes needed for your system by understanding what the expected outcomes are and their application throughout the organization. So when you identify what those processes are, next, 4.1b tells you to determine the sequence and interaction of these processes. What comes first? How do these processes link together? .422c says you have to have a quality manual, and it has to describe the interaction between the processes of your management system. How do they interact together? This is most commonly completed by a process map, but it can also be done in words or a combination thereof. Now 14,001 tells you that your EMS shall include a description of the main elements of the EMS and their interaction. Okay, those of you who stopped tuning in, I know this is a long, boring webinar. This is a really important slide, so look up from your email or Facebook. It's a great slide. Before we talk about the sequence and interaction of the processes of an organization, you first need to do a couple of things. One, you have to define the processes of your organization. This is a critical but often missed step. Then what you want to do is construct a block diagram or process map. What many organizations do is they simply construct a block diagram or process map of your main process, often a manufacturing process. This is not what meets the requirement of 9001-2008. So what you want to do to meet the requirement of 41A of 9001 and 44C of ISO 14001 is simply make a list on a piece of paper of the processes of your organization. How do you do this? Well, you want to bring staff together from various departments and functions and brainstorm together. Don't simply have the management representative do this on their own. Get people from different departments, manager level, director level, coordinator level, operational employee level, and have a brainstorming session and simply make a list of what you think the processes in your organization are. I always tell people when you do this, forget the standards exist. Put them away, put them in a drawer, forget that they exist. Don't name the processes in your organization after the headings or subheadings of the standard unless you talk that way. If you have a process and you talk the monitoring and measuring process, I can't think of anybody who has a process like that. That's a heading in the standard. Product realization. I don't know many companies that say, hello, I'm Shannon and I work in product realization. Companies don't talk that way. Use the language that you speak. Again, the processes should be automatic and instinctive to the employees in your organization. Once you determine the processes of your organization, you want to focus on each process individually. So step 1, make a list of the processes. Step 2, start focusing on each process individually. You want to determine the boundaries of each individual process. And generate a list of steps in the process. The steps in the process should be broken down until further breakdown no longer contributes value. You want to write each step on an index card or sticky note so that you can move them around, and then sequence the steps. Hence, using index cards or sticky notes, it's easy to move them. And determining the sequence is required by 41B of 9001-2008. And you're going to want to repeat this process for as many individual processes as you've defined. So step 1 was to make a list of all the processes in your organization. If you decide there's 6 processes, you repeat step 2 6 times. Keep in mind the theme of today's presentation, outputs matter, and the requirement that you are to monitor, measure, and continually improve the effectiveness of your quality management system. Therefore, for each process, you have to identify a measure of process performance and an associated target. We often call this a key performance indicator. It's required by 41E of 9001-2008 and Clause 433 of 14001-2004. So let's take a minute and talk about what some inappropriate process measures are. And I have a list here. Improve customer satisfaction. Strive to continually improve all processes. That's an ambitious one. Improve delivery performance. Reduce employee turnover and lower PPM. Now you may be saying, well, these all sound great. Why are they inappropriate measures of processes? And the reason is that there's no target. They talk about improving or decreasing or trending in a certain direction, but there's no target. Appropriate examples would include the following. Maintain a close ratio of at least 30% for all quotations. You can measure that. You can see if you're at least at 30%. Scrap rate greater or less than 2%, again, can be measured. Manufacturing process efficiency of greater than 95%. Receive corrective action plans for all internal audit NCRs within 30 days, and complete all planned internal audits. You'll see that some of these Some of these measures are variable and others are attribute in nature, and all or nothing. Example of attribute would be the last two. Either you receive corrective action plans within 30 days or you do not. And the last one, either you complete all planned internal audits or you do not. Regardless, these are all appropriate measures, these 5 listed here, because they can be measured. So what happens when a target isn't met? So if you have, for example, if you have defined a process called internal audits, no requirement to do so, you may have a differently named process that addresses the requirements of 822. But let's say you've defined a process called internal audits. You have a process measure that says we want to complete all planned audits, but you don't. You miss the audit of the purchasing process. What are you required to do? You have to apply suitable methods for monitoring and, where applicable, measuring the QMS processes. When plan results aren't achieved, correction and corrective action shall be taken as appropriate to ensure conformity of the product. What does this mean? Sometimes this means a formal corrective action with containment, correction, root cause, corrective action. This may also mean discussion and management review. If, for example, you're not yet meeting the target, but you've been trending in the right direction, you're moving in the right direction, why would you take a corrective action? But we have to see that you're taking some type of action, however. 8.4c of 9001-2008 says the organization shall determine, collect, and analyze appropriate data to demonstrate the suitability and effectiveness of the QMS. The analysis of data shall provide information relating to characteristics and trends of processes and product, including opportunities for preventive action. So are we trending in the right direction? Okay, urge you to stay awake for a few minutes more, folks. Another really important slide. Earlier we learned that the output of one process was the input of another. You want to watch for these linkages as you construct process maps for individual processes. And these linkages are going to help you when you determine the sequence and interaction of all the processes in your organization. Okay, to solidify some of the concepts that we've been talking about, a process map of a single process versus the interaction of processes of an entire organization, let's look at a practical example we can all relate to, a bakery. So first we're going to start with a block diagram of a single process. And that process is going to be baking and decorating a wedding cake. The input is receiving a spec sheet and ordering a wedding cake, an order for a wedding cake. The output is a wedding cake ready for delivery. We're also going to show you an appropriate measure of process effectiveness for this process, the single process of baking and decorating a wedding cake. And again, you want to repeat this exercise for all the processes on your list. So if you have 8 processes, you're going to go through this exercise 8 times. So here is the process map for the single process in the organization of baking and decorating a wedding cake. You'll see a start and end oval. Starting here, receiving an order and a spec sheet from a wedding coordinator, and then we see the process happening in parallel. Following along on the top, you mix ingredients for the cake, pour the batter into baking pans of appropriate sizes, bake the cakes and let them cool for 24 hours, and then you inspect them. On the bottom, you're mixing the ingredients for the frosting and inspecting the frosting. And then another process in parallel. We'll pick the bottom here first. You assemble, frost, and decorate the cakes, inspect them, whereas at the same time somebody else can be cleaning the baking tools and prep area. And then you securely pack the cake for transport to the reception site before you reach the end oval. Some appropriate process measures for this process of baking and decorating a wedding cake. You want to finish assembling, frosting, and decorating all cakes no more than 6 hours before the cake is packed for transport. You don't want to finish the cake too early to ensure freshness for your customers. So this organization has picked 6 hours as an appropriate measure, and it's something they can measure. There's a target here. They can clearly see if they're meeting no more than 6 hours. And they want 0 customer complaints each month, and they want 0 instances of non-conforming cakes, more of an internal process measure. They don't want to go back and do any rework or repair. So that was a process map for the single process of the bakery, baking and decorating a wedding cake. Now we're going to look at an example, a view from 30,000 feet, of a sequence and interaction of processes for an entire organization. And you're going to see that this looks very different as the process of baking and decorating a wedding cake, which on the prior slide, the process of baking and decorating a wedding cake was many boxes. On this schematic, the view from 30,000 feet, it's just one box. Cake preparation, baking, and decorating. One box here. But we're able to see how it interacts with other processes in the organization. It's got inputs from sales. It provides export. It provides outputs to the cake transport process. Sales gets inputs from marketing. Cake preparation, baking, and decorating, for example, gets inputs from recipe development and management. Okay, now that you understand process maps and the difference between the process map for an individual process and the interaction of processes for all the processes in the organization, let's talk about how we internally audit these processes using the process approach to auditing. This approach is different from a checklist audit. Checklists turn the requirements of the standard into questions. The problem with the checklist audit is the questions never change or grow with the process. I still see countless organizations using checklist audits. The answers from audit to audit year after year are basically the same. I often wonder if people even leave the conference room during those audits. Internal audits, you have to do them anyway. Why not benefit from them? They should be a driver of process improvement. And the process approach to internal audits helps you do just that. You never want to get away from the idea that an internal audit should confirm your management system addresses all the shells or requirements of the standard. Obviously, you have to conform to the requirements. That's why I always suggest a tool such as the PJR Form F191 or an equivalent that you can easily create on your own. So what this does is this takes all the processes that the organization has defined and puts them down the y-axis of the matrix. And then the requirements of the standard are across the x matrix of the standard, the x-axis. And then you put x's into boxes to show which processes address which requirements of the standard. Doing this exercise initially shows you your management system meets all the requirements, and reviewing this matrix on a periodic basis will convince the internal auditor that, in fact, the processes, in spite of any changes that may have occurred, continue to meet the requirements of the standard. Because remember, one of the things that we always have to audit for is conformity. The other we should be doing is driving process improvement. So once you know that your system conforms to the requirements by completing this matrix, at least via the documentation it's conforming, then you can audit your processes as your organization has defined them. Keep in mind the requirements of Section 4.1 as you audit the processes of your organization. So let's review what those requirements are. The first one we've been talking about for a while, identifying the processes needed for your management system, determining the sequence and interaction, determining the criteria and methods needed to ensure that the operation and control of these processes are effective, ensuring the availability of resources and information for the processes, monitoring, measuring, and analyze the processes, and where those monitoring and measurement activities show the process is falling short, implementing actions necessary to achieve planned results and continual improvement. And sometimes those actions are formal corrective actions, but sometimes perhaps discussion and management review will suffice. In order to help you conduct a process approach audit, consider developing an audit working document that focuses on the following: process inputs and outputs, the competencies required for the process, other requirements for the process such as procedures, work instructions, or drawings, equipment and other resources needed, and the measures of process effectiveness. So here's an example of an audit working document. And again, folks, you can easily create something like this on your own. This is the process name, internal audits. We list the process owner, so we know who we're interviewing. The inputs to the process, the outputs, resources needed, competencies required, associated documents, and process measurables. So the intent is you should sit down with this blank piece of paper, in this tabular format, and you ask the process owner these questions. What are the inputs to the process? And they would answer, oh, we have a schedule. We have key KPI data used to identify problematic parts of the process. We've got customer complaint data. What is the output? And they'll say, well, the output is a completed audit working document, maybe some NCRs. What do you need to conduct your audits? Laptops, pens and pencils, and the internal auditors need to wear hair bonnets and aprons for the audit when they go into the baking area. So you want to sit down with the process owner face to face and ask these questions. Your notes should be documented maybe on a form like this. One of the things that PGR auditors are always looking for is traceable, verifiable, objective evidence. There is no value in regurgitating the content of a procedure in your audit notes, in your audit records. We need traceable, verifiable evidence. So here we're seeing that in the last internal audit that was conducted, there were 5 NCRs, numbers 93 to 97. It looks like the auditor followed up on all of those NCRs. They have specific notes about how the corrective action for those NCRs were. We know who the internal auditors are. It's clear the internal auditors were interviewed. We looked at the audit schedule. We looked at KPI data. All of these are good audit notes that show what was learned here was actually validated, and we need that in a good internal audit report. So your strategy should be to interview the process owner using the audit working document as a tool, that first page, and then confirm the interview results through observation of the process, review of process documents, and records and interviews with people actually doing the work. So you may sit down with a very convincing process owner and say, yes, we've got a great internal audit schedule, we've completed all our audits, and we have 5 NCRs. At that point, it's just anecdotal evidence. You actually have to see these records and talk to the internal auditors doing the work, and then make explicit notes that can be that allow someone to recreate the audit trail. Include form numbers, part numbers, NCR numbers, people's names, etc. You always want to ask the process owner, how do you know the process is working or improving? And their answer should link to the process measurable or KPI. always remembering here that outputs matter. You also always want to ask them, well, what do you do or how do you react when the process doesn't meet the target you've defined, or it's at least not trending in the right direction? And they should talk about the actions, which may be corrective actions that they take. Some other techniques for effective internal audits. Of course, you want to remember the guidance we provide in our root cause corrective action webinar about how to properly document an audit finding using the 3 parts: statement of finding, evidence, citation of the requirement not being met. PGR is an internal document which we don't share that gives our auditors tips for effective audits. You want to set yourself up for success. Their audit plans should reflect the names of the processes of the organization being audited, not the sections and clauses of the standard. Similarly, your internal audit plans should do the same. If you define 6 processes in your organization, your internal audit plan should only list 6 processes. And outputs matter. Make sure the customer-specific requirements and their expected outcomes are integrated into your process-based internal audit. You want to make sure your internal auditors are competent. Keep in mind that competence is different than training. People may attend an expensive training course for 5 days and not be competent auditors. You have to establish very specific competency requirements for your internal auditors and then prove that your internal auditors meet these requirements. Sometimes the competency requirements can be met in ways other than getting formal, expensive training. And of course, internal auditors have to be independent of the area that they're auditing. That ends today's lecture portion of the webinar. I'll now open the floor to any comments or questions that you have. As I stated earlier, we've muted all the participants to ensure sound quality. So please type your questions into the chat or question feature of the WebEx. Just going to wait a few minutes to see if we get any questions. Question from Dawn. Just confirming that what you pick for processes is how you pick your KPIs. So the first thing you want to do, Dawn, is obviously make a list of processes. The requirement is that you measure wherever you can your processes, and if you can't measure something, you at least have to monitor it. You can monitor through internal audits, for example. But yes, you ideally will have a measurement technique, or if not, a monitoring technique for all of your processes. Jeff, the F191 can be provided to you by your scheduler. You can easily create this as an Excel document on your own. Mary Lou's asking for a sample of the forms. We share the F191. We don't share the other internal audit forms. I do that because then everybody's internal audit forms will look the same. That's just one strategy. You can certainly copy these from the webinar slides, but you want to make sure that you're using an internal audit format that works for you. This is just one tool, Mary Lou, that will drive a good process-based audit. And a copy of this presentation is available on our website, www.pjr.com. Just going to wait a few more minutes to see if there's any other questions. Any other questions, please feel free to type into the question or chat feature. If we don't get any, then we'll extend early. Jeff's asking how many certified internal auditors should you have for a company of 100 employees? First of all, Jeff, just want to make sure that you know that internal auditors don't need to be certified. They have to meet the competency requirements your organization defines and any customer-specific requirements. For example, Ford Motor Company has very specific requirements for TS 16949 internal auditors. And you need to have enough internal auditors to ensure auditor independence. You might be able to do that with 100 employees with 5 people if they represent different areas, perhaps less. But no requirement for internal auditor certification. At least per the standard, unless your organization makes it a requirement or your customers make it a requirement. Okay, folks, looks like there's no more questions coming in. Thanks for participating today. I hope you found the webinar helpful. I encourage you to check out our website, www.pjr.com, for copies and a digital recording of today's webinar, as well as information on future webinars. Goodbye.